Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're in. I'm going to do a little housekeeping while we're waiting for a few extra people to log on. Everyone who is on the phone is currently muted except for our presenters. I'll be throwing this over to our director, Eric Sundquist, to do the introductions. But in the meantime, if you are interested in checking any of the information on this webinar, or if you know someone who couldn't get on to the webinar, we will have a recording of this. It'll be up on our website probably tomorrow, and the slides from the webinar will also be up on our website. If anyone is interested in getting continuing education credits for this, you will have to do a self-report. You'll receive a certificate that shows that you did log on to the webinar, and then you can self-report to whichever agency or branch you need for your continuing education credits. So if you are interested in asking questions, we will be taking those at the end. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. Just type your questions into the chat box, and then we'll read them off to our presenters at the end. If you don't see the chat box, you may need to click on the little orange arrow that should be in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and that'll bring the dashboard out, and you can type your question in. So again, this is going to be recorded. It will be up on our website, and you'll be able to access that starting tomorrow. So I am now going to let Eric Sundquist do introductions for our panelists, and I'm just going to give Eric, I'm going to give you the keyboard, and then when you're done, we'll give the keyboard and mouse control over to Fred.
Great, thanks, Robbie. I am Eric Sundquist, Director of SSTI. For those not familiar with SSTI, been around since 2010. We are housed at the University of Wisconsin. We are also a joint project with Smart Growth America since last year. We work with state DOTs around the country on a voluntary basis. They attend our meetings and do peer-to-peer sharing. We provide technical assistance, and then I send you to our website, ssti.us, for a variety of materials, including one that I'm going to describe right now. It's not advancing, Robbie.
If you just click on the slide, you should be able to advance to the next one.
Yep. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to come back to this one. So on our website, you will find something called Modernizing Mitigation. This is an attempt to take what Fred is going to talk about, and I'll introduce him in just a second, in a particular way, and broaden it out to the rest of, to other applications within California and the rest of the country. And this hopefully will make sense once you hear Fred's great presentation. But basically, this is, just keep in mind that most of the country doesn't have a law called CEQA. Everybody mitigates for traffic demand. Every DOT does it, whether it's within a driveway permit or buildings within a certain buffer of the state system, and every city, pretty much every city and locality does transportation impact assessments for new development, and they mitigate through rules about parking or through ad hoc decision making when rezonings are considered and so forth. So as you hear Fred's great case study, you can then try, the intent of this document that's on our website is to try to generalize that and make some rules that we can all look at regardless of whether we have CEQA or not. So with that, if I can go back, yes. Fred Dock is one of the great heroes, I think, in our field. And I don't know, he's modest, and I hope I'm not embarrassing him, but I really sincerely mean that. I've been following Pasadena's work on mitigation for several years, we were out doing some work for the Secretary of Transportation in California in 2012-13 timeframe, and Pasadena was already working on this reform. At the same time that the state was looking at it legislatively, Fred will describe how those two processes sort of dovetailed, but suffice it to say, Pasadena is got out in front of the law and the rulemaking, and is the example with the longest track record and the most to learn from at this point. Fred's been at Pasadena as the Director of Transportation since 2007, before which he had a long career in the private sector. So again, just delighted to have Fred on. I got to be at TRB with him with this presentation, so I know that you will enjoy it. So I am going to pass it off to Fred.
Okay, and while I'm transferring control over to Fred, I just want to remind people who have just logged on that we are recording this, and if you want to access any of the information later, we'll have it up on our website tomorrow. You can also get a certificate that shows that you've attended this, and if you'd like to ask a question, just type it into the chat box, and we'll take those at the end. Okay, Fred, if you click on the slide, you should now be able to control the slides.
Muted.
Us there first. It's not moving, Robbie. Oh, there it goes. I'll just slow down. Okay. Great. Well, thanks, everybody. I'm glad to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about what Pasadena has been doing and how we've been able to work with our metrics that we use to evaluate both our plans and projects and how that's working out for us. Partly, I wanted to put this together in a framework that sort of talked a little bit about what did we do and why did we do it and how's it going. And hopefully through that process can bring you up to speed on how the city of Pasadena has approached this, because we started looking at using different metrics than level of service or auto delay for a variety of reasons, many of which was the fact that we were operating in an environment, as I'll go through in a minute here, where we had sort of deviated from our overall planning outcomes that the city council was working towards, and our metrics were operating at sort of counter purposes to that. So that's what started us looking, and what we actually wound up doing, and it's more than just the use of VMT or vehicle miles of travel as a metric. It was about understanding how do we continue to deal with this from both a planning and an implementation process to make sure that we've aligned our plans and our policies to be able to generate the outputs or outcomes that our general plan is seeking, since that's really kind of the primary document in California that guides what cities are supposed to be doing in terms of land use and mobility policy. We effectively, as you can see here, made a note that we were organized around a complete streets framework, which also aligns with state requirements. But in doing so, as we went through and evaluated all these different types of things, these other steps that we begin to show you here, and that I'll talk about a little bit more in detail as we go through the presentation, are the process of how we put this framework together, how we essentially developed an outcome-based approach to what we were measuring and how we were measuring it and what we were putting priorities and emphasis on, and how we developed and organized a process that allowed us to have a consistent level of evaluation and review at all different levels of the process program. And then the last step is something I would like to emphasize, is that there are a lot of program delivery components that need to be thought of as one begins to look at using different metrics, and I will highlight those as we go forward here. So with that, I'll move ahead. The real question that we were running into here, and I think it's something that if you've listened to any of the Office of Planning and Research materials from the state here in California about it, is that what we're seeing is that as we look solely at auto level of service or the vehicle delay as a metric, we begin to organize mitigation measures or improvements that are necessary to reduce those impacts around things that reduce auto delay. And those may not necessarily generate the kind of outcomes that you're being looked for when you're beginning to think more holistically about the transportation system and how we travel. And what we were finding in the city here was is that we had a very strong and enduring guiding principle that the city needed to be able to place to circulate without a car. That's been in our planning lexicon here since the early 1990s. And the city takes it pretty seriously, even though we are very auto-oriented still in some places. But what we were finding as we were going through our traffic impact analysis process is that we were simply widening roadways. We were adding turn lanes, we were cutting into properties, and it was being done in a very piecemeal kind of a fashion as we would go through and look at individual projects or plan elements and begin to come up with things to mitigate traffic impact to these intersections. Sometimes we'd be looking at 50 or 60 intersections in a single project, given the size of it. And so what we were beginning to bring out of that is that we ran out of room to widen roadways to begin with, since Pasadena is a very strongly historic preservation type of a place here, if you know us at all from that standpoint. And so we essentially had to own up to the fact that we weren't going to be widening any roadways. We weren't going to be adding new roads, since we're built out already in terms of a street network. And we needed to be able to do something that began to look at not impacting what we were making it harder for people to cross the street or to use bicycles or other forms of transportation to be able to get around. This happened to dovetail back in the early mid-2000s with a series of state mandates for greenhouse gas reduction and the need to incorporate complete streets into the comprehensive planning process. So it was really a joint effort that we were beginning to address as we updated our general plan. As I say here, at a practice level, the kind of things that we were running into when we began to go back and take a serious look at, well, how did we do with our traffic impact analysis for projects that had already been built, we began to find that we'd been doing a lot of sort of doom and gloom forecasting. The methodology we were using tended to overestimate the amount of impact on the travel network, and that once those projects had been built and occupied, we weren't seeing the same level of traffic operations delay that we had been predicting in the report. So we sat down to try to figure out how to begin to understand what that mismatch was and how could we adjust this so we had a better predictive process. And in the process, that's what you're seeing here. It also tended to have an impact on some other major programs we were working on to manage traffic and to provide for alternate modes. So the way we approached it was to step back to the beginning of our process, in which we had the opportunity to do because we were updating our general plan starting in about 2009 or 10. And we were able then to step back and look at how can we get to the outcomes that we're looking for. What did we need within our planning process to be able to adjust and adhere to policy and make sure that what the general plan said we were going to be doing is what we were doing. And that's really then sort of the cryptic nature of how we generated this process and started working on using the complete streets mandate as a basis for helping to align the different components of the project. And I call it vertically integrated. But it really is an issue of the fact that we now have in place a process that allows us to use the same types of tools and the same analytical procedures to be able to evaluate plans, programs, and projects, and from that then to get to the implementation of those outcomes through a series of programmatic elements like street design guidelines and transportation impact fees as we go along here. That took us quite a bit of time to be able to do that, but it's also left us in a position to be able to measure what's important and to be able to report on that to the public on a more regular basis now. I will talk a little bit about the Complete Streets framework, only in the context of how it's used to underpin the process. We have an entire another sort of slide presentation on what we're doing in Complete Streets, but this is really more about the idea of using the framework of a context-based approach to street classification to help underpin all of our different modal plan elements, which really then factor into how well we're doing in moving people around outside of being able to drive, as well as how we're doing driving around. And so within that framework, then we went back and stepped back and looked at what was the form and function of our transportation network, and we then tied that to our general plan land use component. What we wound up with then is a street network that looks a little bit different than the typical collector local arterial type of approach. And it also has a two-dimensional framework to it that essentially looks at the context of the land use adjacent to the street system. And so we were focusing then on using this as the basis for underpinning how we looked at our transit system operation, how we looked at our connectivity for our bicycles and pedestrians, and how we then basically began to build up the network framework for how we had an overall transportation system plan that started with our movement system of streets, looked at how you would get around if you were a transit user, how you'd get around if you were of bicyclists and sort of what proximity and a pedestrian. And from that, well, what metrics do we need to be able to measure that to make sure that we're delivering on the system and the projects that we're evaluating fit into that framework and can be addressed as we go forward. And that's really then what led to the development of a series of metrics that really addressed what was important to measure for our policies. And it's no surprise here. Obviously, we had been measuring auto level of service traffic volumes, and we were really only mitigating those types of impacts because that's all that was being required of us under our California Environmental Quality Act to be able to do that. Where we were going then and where we had to go was to really to start looking at how do we begin to align our transportation metrics and our transportation outcomes with the state's greenhouse gas requirements or the need to reduce greenhouse gases. How do we basically bring up in priority within our transportation evaluation those non-auto modes, even if they are using the auto network. And those begin to then focus seriously on looking at conditions for those users of the networks. We have a lot of conversation, I'm sure many of you had, within the overall profession about how do we measure the performance on say, a bicycle network. Is it really the number of bicyclists? Is it the conditions they're operating under? What is it? And so we began to experiment and look at what types of techniques were available to be able to do that and move forward to understand how that fit into overall metric process. As we begin to look more and more at the street network and the transit and bicycle and pedestrian networks and focus on connectivity and accessibility as measures of mobility, we then got to seriously be looking at network performance, which is something that we had been doing intermittently to date, but really begin to take on more and more emphasis as we went further down this pathway of trying to determine what metrics to use. And in those, we in the end wound up looking seriously at things that looked like, that would give us an overall idea of how the automobile network is performing across the city. Are we getting the right levels of speed management? Are we making reliable travel times? Not that we're necessarily reducing or removing congestion, but are we managing it in a way that it makes it so that somebody can understand what the reproducibility of a trip during a particular time of day is. And so from this, we wound up over about a 4 or 5 year period developing a set of new metrics that started out. And this is where the sort of the tail of SB 743, which is the California state legislation that mandates the use of vehicle miles of travel now, dovetails with what we've been doing, because we're now up to about 2013. We've gone through roughly 4 years of background work, working with the community to identify and test out different types of metrics to be used here, and have settled on working through and feel that the idea of using vehicle miles traveled per capita, in this case a service population, which is defined as a combination of the residents and employees that would be in a particular area that we're looking at, as opposed to just residents or just employees, would be a metric that we felt was functional, would help us understand our link to sustainability, and would give us an effective look at how the city is meeting its overall travel goals within the regional constraints from environmental impact. That particular methodology had not yet been identified by the state, but as we were moving forward and moving this, we had begin thinking that we would wind up having to sort of add this onto our level of service metrics and begin to add in more. So instead of looking at just automobile travel, we'd look at automobile travel and vehicle miles of travel and bicycles and pedestrians and transit in a more robust look of metrics as we went forward here. But around 2013, the state adopted SB 743, and while the legislature didn't mandate a particular methodology, that assigned the Office of Planning and Research to determine that methodology, the language in SB 743 is fairly specific about not using level of service. And so our city attorney at that point advised us that we wouldn't be able to go forward to council and ask them to adopt a metric, i.e. level of service, that had already been effectively outlawed by the state. So it pushed us down a path that really at that point we had to begin to regroup a little bit and figure out how are we going to explain all of this stuff if we don't have level of service in our metrics. And that's really then where we went from 2013 to 2015. What we wound up coming out of is the metrics that I'm about to show you here that are really focused on meeting our general plan goals and consistency of being able to be a place where you can travel without a car, as well as where you can be able to travel with a car if you need to and be able to support businesses that need car access and things like that. In terms of our overall sustainability, we really did focus on the vehicle miles traveled per capita. We added to that something called vehicle trips per capita, which is a metric that looks at the intensity of trip making at a particular location. This was a unit we felt was important to bring in to be able to address the fact that when looking at VMT production on the larger scale, you can bring in a fairly intensive trip producing use into an area that actually reduces the overall VMT per capita across the area, because you're able to reorient. Say you bring in a missing land use, you're able to attract trips from the local area and maybe shorten previously longer distance trips that are then coming to the new closer in use. That doesn't really reflect, while that kind of a calculation allows you to meet your overall sort of regional larger scale VMT goals, you still wind up with a fairly intensive trip generation at the local project level. And so we felt the vehicle trips per capita was a way to begin to address that and to be able to ask projects to adopt and address more travel demand management measures at the curb front level to be able to do it. So the combination of these two begin to become our primary vehicle-based, our auto travel-based metrics that were being used in our analysis. The city is allowed to set thresholds under CEQA as long as they're evidence-based. That's something that's been in the California Environmental Quality Act legislation from the beginning. And so we worked through that. We read the guidance that just came out this year from OPR for what we should be using for thresholds. And so our city attorney had recommended at that point that we needed to stay within demonstrated levels that we had existing at the time. And so we essentially agreed upon using the existing citywide levels of VMT per capita and vehicle trips per capita as our thresholds of significance. So if a project would come in or a plan area would come in and generate more VMT per capita than our existing levels, then that would be an impact of significance that we would have to mitigate. We also then chose a particular methodology to operate with this, and that's where we're a little bit out of sync with where the overall program is going in California at this point in time. And that's that we are continuing to use a fairly detailed travel demand model that works well for Pasadena. It's helpful that we have the resources to support that. It's not necessarily something that other cities, as you've probably seen or heard in previous presentations from other cities, are using at the same scale that we are. But in terms of what we've been trying to accomplish, it works fairly well within Pasadena. And part of that is because of the way our general plan has played out over the last 20 years and how our city has evolved since the early 1990s. And that's really illustrated by the VMT diagram or VMT per capita diagram that you see on the right here, where we have a central district that has a very good level of VMT per capita. It's very dense development. It's where all of our newer development since 1994 has been focused in a mixed-use format. It's very much an infill poster child type of an approach. And so it is supported very well by the idea that we're getting a better, more efficient travel operation out of that area in terms of VMT per capita. As we get further and further from the core, we get back into lower and lower density single-family neighborhoods, less and less multifamily housing, and then that then shows up in higher VMT per capita production in those areas. And so the model allows us to be able to detail the interaction of bringing in different land uses into this mix, almost at a parcel level, but at least with a very small TAZ level. And so it allows us to take advantage of understanding how our trip making within Pasadena is affected, as well as our trip making to sources outside of Pasadena. To then address the other portions of the general plan, which had to do with focusing on the metrics for how do we bring forward more of an understanding of how the system is designed, how are we doing in terms of being able to let people travel other methods if they so choose. We, in the end, rather than going with an individual level of service or an individual performance metric on the basis of transit or pedestrians or bicycles, we relied back on the series of literature that's available that talks about that essentially demonstrates that the proximity to a particular level of service of transit or a particular type of bikeway facility will increase the propensity for people to be using that mode, at least for some of their travel. And so in doing so, we've elected to stick with this proximity metric, where we essentially defined what routes, level 1 or level 2 transit facilities, are those service levels that have 15-minute headways or less. What we then wound up doing was being able to map the city, map the network of where our transit service by what our frequency of service was, length and span of service, and then we essentially rate projects on how close they are to that network, because the idea that if somebody's within a 5-minute walk or a quarter mile of one of those higher density or higher frequency service network points, then you have a much higher likelihood that somebody will actually use transit to get to and from that site. And so that's the process and the methodology that we've used to do this. We apply it to transit over the city. The heat map here shows you how our level 1 and 2 network shows up with the red areas being the highest frequency service patterns in the city. We do the same thing from a, let me back up here to, I must have missed bicycles. Same thing for the bicycle network, where we're looking at actually the presence of some sort of a separated bicycle facility, whether it's an on-road bike lane, a protected bike lane, off-road path, which we have very few of. Most of our system is on road. And again, you can see the heat map where we're doing here. And these are all then based on making sure that we have a network of connectivity, and those are then defined in our general plan mobility element to be able to provide a connected network for bicycles, high frequency transit, and looking then, while that we tried doing that with the pedestrian side, it was very difficult to deal with from that standpoint. And so the quality of network is obviously very important, and the connectivity of network is also important from the pedestrian side of people walking. But what we've been seeing in the literature and what we were working on was telling us that it really was about access to destinations within a walkable distance. And the variety of destinations within a distance was really what was one of those things that was more closely correlated with the propensity to walk in an area. And so that's really then what we were able to set up and translate into something that we could deal with in a travel demand model. And that's really what we're showing here and what we use. We use a pedestrian accessibility score, and it really has to do with the accessibility within a particular 5-minute walk to a destinations. And this sort of shows you the heat map of how our diversity of destinations and plays out on a citywide basis, with our central district having a much higher score than our outer level areas. The red areas are basically pretty much single-family areas that have been protected since the mid-1990s, and there really are just residential single-family uses in there and no commercial or office uses there. So moving along, if I can get the slides to move, there we go. Moving into how's it working out, I think as we said, the short version is so far so good. We've been looking at where we are now for a little over 3 years. We adopted and the council approved our metrics late in 2014, and so we were able to start using them for our analysis of traffic impacts, transportation impacts early in 2015, and have been going along ever since. At the general sort of 30,000 foot level, what we're seeing is very encouraging in that the metrics are supporting our ability to encourage general plan compliance. So as we see projects coming in that have sort of the inappropriate mix of uses for the area that might be too travel intensive in particular one areas, we're beginning to see an iteration of those projects that's getting to a more balanced mix of uses within the development at the individual scale. And so there's several examples of that we can talk about, but generally what we're seeing here is that we are understanding how better to take advantage of the relationship of VMT and how trips are produced, both long distance and short distance trips, as we look at the mix of development within a particular type of area or within a particular development itself. The big thing that we've wound up seeing is that our use of the VMT and VT metrics have reduced the burden on some of the smaller projects in the city that conform to the general plan. We're not seeing a lot of significant impacts where those projects come in that fit within the zoning and land use types that are included in those areas for the general plan. So we're again concurring compliance with the general plan, which was one of our outcomes was. Because much of Pasadena is infill from a development standpoint, this whole concept streamlines that process. The state actually is, with the guidelines that have just been introduced for statewide use right now, has provided for even further streamlining, which the city of Pasadena has not used to date yet. We have quite a bit of a local bent to want to continue to see the analytics and to move forward rather than to just exempt something that even though it's allowed under state law. So that's a kind of a work in process for Pasadena. But we have been able to use staff to do most of the analytics as we go forward here, and that has also then shortened the process for project proponents as they apply, because we have to review the results of the traffic impact analyses that are done by consultants. In this case, if we're doing them, we have a little bit better control over the time frame it takes us to get things done and how it works forward here. One of the things that has happened, which has been good and bad, is that the use of VMT has really shifted the focus of our environmental quality analysis away from traffic congestion as the metric. That, as you can imagine, has some ups and downs. I'm kind of pointed out here that it does place more emphasis on the need for system management and measurement. That gets back to our network discussion of what metrics are we looking at to make sure that the system is functional for everybody overall. But it also then allows us to look at more detailed traffic analysis outside of the CEQA process when necessary by looking at a much closer in a block level or block face review of the projects that had been previously being done through the environmental quality process, being done in a two-tiered step where we have a more of a regional and general metrics that we're looking at CEQA, and then as the case basis, we're then looking at how projects are dealing with it at a block level face or block face level. Obviously, people are still interested in traffic congestion, and that tends to be one of the issues that we're still working on with the community. Brief summary, we have looked at a number of projects here, as you can see, somewhere I guess around 40. This is current as of about 4 months ago. As we looked in here, we have the green dots are those projects that are large enough that we've provided a CEQA analysis of them. They have looked at VMT as a primary metric, and the ones that are green have had no unmitigated impact. We've either been able to mitigate it by modifying project size components or mixes of uses, or by adopting VMT reducing mitigation measures as part of the projects. Obviously, only 3 of those required some sort of mitigation, and those have been implemented as part of the overall approval process. We have a much larger scale look at other projects that are not quite of community significance, which are essentially above about 50,000 square feet. And those are smaller projects that are all infill residential to a large extent. And we have been working with those. We have more localized mitigation requirements for those. And that sort of shows you the way our development pattern adheres to our central core concepts and doesn't get out into the neighborhoods too much. To date, and should probably find some wood to knock on as we go along here, we have had no CEQA challenges, and all of the projects that you see on the screen here have all gone past the statute of limitations for filing a challenge under state law. So to date, then, our process is being upheld at this point, and we're comfortable continuing to move forward with it. Get the slides to change here. There we go. I think at this point, I'd kind of like to move into just a brief wrap up of what we are seeing as sort of the challenges that we've learned from this process. I think it's something to point out that Pasadena, obviously what I was trying to point out without belaboring is we got here maybe by a slightly different process than cities following us will go through as they try to adapt to state law here. But I think it's important to look at it from the standpoint that we were very self-selecting in how we did this. We picked a set of methodologies that achieved the outcomes, and it really highlighted the kind of priorities that the city, or shared the priorities that the city has said are important to us. Even so, in that framework, the learning curve in this can be really, really steep. VMT is not something that's easy to explain to people, particularly when you're trying to explain some of the counterintuitive things that where VMT changes might go in the different direction from where you would expect them to go. It's very unfamiliar to the community. It's it's mainly a very wonkish transportation planning approach that hasn't gone much outside of the industry. It's beginning to get wider acceptance, but it's going to be an issue as we go forward here. It's also the issue is that it's something that, as Eric and his report have illustrated, the mitigation options are difficult. We have a lot of information about how it works on an individual basis for travel demand management programs, but what we're missing is really a lot of information about how those cumulative effects of adding up those different individual travel demand management aspects can apply to different types of projects. So I think there's still some research needed, but we're certainly getting more and more information about it as we go forward here. The other big issue is that there's a desire or a tendency to want to equate the VMT metrics with the previous level of service metrics. And that's an area where we would recommend against trying to do that, because you're going down 2 different pathways. The VMT metric is really a measure of sustainability as opposed to auto delay or performance on the network, whereas the level of service is really about motorist delay. And so it's really hard to argue that the 2 things measure the same outcome, because they don't. And so you need to think of them as disconnected and being able to support the reason for why VMT is an important metric, independent of what it relates to in terms of level of service. There's still an issue that we run into in terms of that people can assume that we're just ignoring traffic congestion, or that we're ignoring neighborhood traffic intrusions. And we've tried to address those in a variety of ways, both from system management level and better sort of daylighting of our metrics and our performance on a day-to-day basis, as well as the focusing our outside of CEQA work on neighborhood traffic protection in the neighborhoods, traffic protection in the neighborhoods, which we've been doing for about 30 years now. Technically, if you choose the approach, the Pasadena approach that we've used with the travel demand forecasting model, you have to remember the model requires regular updating, and that's really where we're sort of four or 5 years out of the gate or in our first update of our model and are coming along. And that's pretty much kind of where it's going right now. I wanted to talk a little bit as we finish up here about sort of what we're doing. A quick thing that we're looking at. We do have access to better data these days at the very micro level. We've been working in this case with streetlight data, but there are other providers of this type of information that we're using to calibrate our model update. This is our traffic analysis zone, and you can begin to see if you can compare this back to the original diagram, which was based on census tracts. This is now based on our TAZs, and you can begin to see how there's a much finer grained relationship to some of our commercial and denser mixed use areas than there is within the larger census tract blocks. So we're using this finer grained data to get us to a better forecasting methodology as we update the model. Our model is basically focused out of the regional model, and at some point the regional model is going to go to a trip chaining approach, and we'll have to update the model even further at that point from our foresight. Slow change here. I would direct you to our traffic impact analysis guidelines or transportation guidelines, where we talk about our hybrid approach to looking at our CEQA metrics and our project approval conditions, where we are actually still using level of service at a very localized level. I think I have another slide about that. And that's really what we're doing. This is the types of things we're looking at as we evaluate projects on a block face level and a nearby impact level, particularly in terms of neighborhood traffic intrusion in residential areas. We also, independent of that, during our pre-project reviews, are looking at using some environmental quality indices developed by San Francisco to look at how pedestrian and bicycle environments on the block frontages to projects need to be adjusted and be addressed, in addition to the system level things that our CEQA metrics look at. And then lastly, how did we do this whole thing? It wasn't just by changing the metrics and changing our plans. It was about aligning our implementation programs, which the city already had in place, but many cities don't. Although I think if you go and look at some of the cities that have adopted VMT metrics to date, like San Jose and San Francisco and Oakland, you will find these kinds of programs are part of their implementation and adoption. But we have an impact fee. We've been able to adopt and update our impact fee to be able to be VMT based, so there's an alignment with that. As the process of doing that, and out of our last general plan update, we were able to then bring in not only vehicular traffic mitigation components into the facilities list that is used to base the impact fee on, but we were able to bring in bicycle and pedestrian and transit capital investments as well. So we now have a multimodal transportation impact fee. We have a trip reduction ordinance that applies to mixed-use buildings or single-use buildings above a certain size. That's basically sets the floor for all of our travel to management programs and has allowed us to become very selective about what we take as a credit above that base trip reduction ordinance level. And then we've also been able to expand our neighborhood traffic management program, which we have been running since the late 1990s, and expand that to what we're calling a complete streets program that now looks not just at local streets, but also looks at all streets in an area and focuses on how do we integrate an operations strategy to be able to address traffic calming and traffic management in the area. And that has allowed us to develop a framework of a 6-step program that we use to engage the public when we do these complete street workshops. I've talked a little bit about it, but I haven't, and it was in the diagrams before, but I don't want to minimize it. I won't spend much time on it now, but we have spent quite a bit of time on our overall network management and operations approaches to be able to do that. We are lucky to have a traffic management center and an interconnected signal system of about 330 traffic locations, which allows us to do travel time monitoring, allows us to be using a very adaptive traffic control type of program for queue and flow management, and it integrates into our ability to be more quickly responding to be able to put speed management and pedestrian accessibility activities, as well as some, our bike lane program is slower than I would like it to be, but all of these things are all part of management strategies that underpin how we deal with overall system and network management. So when somebody has an issue about traffic congestion and there's complaints about a new development maybe adding too much traffic, we're able to basically go back and rely upon some of the metrics and the measurements that we've been able to develop through our management strategies and monitoring to be able to help address those issues, that yes, we are able to manage the network, and that we would anticipate being able to manage the network going forward using these same types of techniques. And I think with that, I am out of slides and hopefully not too much out of time, but I appreciate the opportunity to present and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Unmuted.
Well, thank you very much, Fred. Very informative of a new approach for doing traffic mitigation. I think it'll be very helpful to a lot of people. I do want to remind everyone who's on that if you have questions, you can go ahead and type them into the chat box, and then we can take a look at those questions and ask them of our presenters. If you don't see the chat box, just click on the little orange arrow in the upper right-hand corner and the chat box should appear. So I'm going to go ahead and go through a few of the questions that are coming in. So we have one person, looks like it's from Humboldt County, and he says, we struggle applying VMT in a rural setting. Arcata and Humboldt County and the services, jobs, and housing aren't consolidated in any particular location. I think he means the heat map would likely have a series of lukewarm patches throughout Humboldt. Do you have any advice for resources for rural areas applying VMT?
Well, and that's my advice would be to go to the OPR guidance that's in the SB 743 documents that have been recently released to look at that. I know they've been providing rural guidance with that, and that's something that Pasadena doesn't really have. We're not an analogous kind of a situation. We're a built urbanized area. Doesn't really have even barely a suburban component to it. So I understand the complexity of what you're running into in a rural environment or an ex-urban environment, and I think that OPR has done a pretty good job of identifying tools and approaches, and I'm sure that it's going to take a lot of work to be able to apply those in your environment there.
Okay, great. We do have a question about how you handle the industrial or warehouse land use projects and truck trips with the VMT metric.
That again is where we're relying upon our forecasting tool to do that. We don't have at one level, we can argue that there's sort of an existing level of travel built into that, but what we're doing is we're still using it, we're applying our VMT metric using our forecast tool for the land use site, but we also then are relying upon the vehicle trip metric to be able to focus more on the fact that we've got a little bit different relationship between sort of employees or that are on site and the number of vehicles that are moving back and forth on it. Same thing goes with our retail types of elements there. And so we are addressing it, but not directly.
Okay. We actually have two people who asked how you collect the VMT data for the model.
We're relying upon the calibration of the four-step forecasting model to generate that's how we're getting the VMT calculation. All of the VMT, including existing, is calculated using the model. Okay.
Great. And then someone asked if you could walk through a case study for a submitted development. What are the steps they went through, and what were the mitigation measures?
Well, I'll use an example of one where we actually had an adjustment during the submittal process, and when a little bit beyond that. The city, essentially, the development review process here starts with something called I think it's a pre-project review, where that starts the clocks running on all of the development review process in the city, where the applicant brings in a package that is essentially their initial submittal to the city with all of the various information about the project detailed. If the project is above a certain size, and again, I would refer people to our transportation impact analysis guidelines because that spells it out. But if say it's a project of community-wide significance above 50,000 square feet, then we would start by taking the information about the project as soon as it's submitted. Our staff would plug it into our travel demand forecasting model, run the model to understand what the VMT and vehicle trip per capita impacts are. And then we would report those back as part of our initial planning review of the project. At that point, the project sponsor in a very short period of time has some indication of whether or not they're going to be expecting to see a CEQA analysis of the project. Because if we identify any kind of an impact under the CEQA guidelines, they're required to do a more detailed environmental study. So that's why we do that initial screening of projects to be able to, and it's not just transportation, there's also all the other 20-something subject areas of CEQA that are being looked at by our planning department to be able to provide the same kind of information. So in our case, I'll use an example, a project that was rehabilitating an old hospital campus in the northeast portion of the city. So it was sort of sitting out on the edge of the city's area. It's outside of our developed area, but it's a previously existing use that was being reoccupied. And they were proposing to reoccupy it as medical offices and medical facilities of a variety of types. The project originally had some residential on it, assisted living, that the developers had developed, and so they had taken it out before bringing it into their initial submittal. As we went through the initial evaluation of the project, we determined they were going to have a VMT impact because of the intensity of use within the area and their lack of proximity to the transit and bicycle network in the area. And so having identified that, we were then able to work with them to determine, after a variety of sort of scenario tests, what might work. And it turned out that putting the senior assisted living back on the site and reoccupying that component of the project actually reduced their VMT per capita production to something below significance. And so that allowed the project to proceed. They actually chose to proceed on that basis rather than trying to go through and work on some sort of an exemption basis. That's not, well, I shouldn't say it's not typical. It's one of the ways that we're seeing the project work. What we're seeing, though, in those projects that actually require some mitigation is that the process essentially proceeds the same way. We get up to the point where the environmental document is completed, and as part of that development of the environmental impact report or a mitigated neg dec for the negative declaration for the project, then mitigation has to be provided. And in those cases where we have mitigation required, we've either been able to successfully develop more stringent travel demand management requirements in terms of program elements that the project would add. In one case, we had a project that was having an impact on for lack of bicycle connectivity, and they were able to effectively advance the construction of a piece of the network through a fair share contribution. Those were the kinds of mitigation then that were brought into the calculation that allowed them to mitigate their impacts and the documents to be completed with no overriding considerations for transportation. At the project level, that's slightly different, but those go in as conditions of approval, which most people are familiar with, and those are addressed with things that happen after the project is approved and after building permits are approved and before certificates of final occupancy are issued.
Okay, great.
That's about all I was going to say on it.
Oh, okay. So I have there's a quick question here, which someone wanted to know how to get copies of the trip reduction ordinance, the TIA guidelines, and the
Sorry,
TDM.
Remy, broke up.
Oh, I'm sorry. They wanted to know how this person can get copies of your trip reduction ordinance, the TIA guidelines, and the TDM ordinance and guidelines.
They're on our website, cityofpasadena.net, or if they just want to email me, I'll be glad to send them a link.
Okay. And I'm also just going to put a pitch in here for our report that we mentioned at the beginning, which is on the SSTI website, ssti.us. We have links to a number of different city ordinances and policies, besides Pasadena, a few other ones around the country that took different approaches to traffic mitigation. So you can get that at ssti.us, and I'm just going to throw that up there so that people can get that website. So we had a couple of people asking how both Amazon and Uber, Lyft are affecting VMT.
And I'd have to say I don't have any direct measurements in Pasadena of that.
Okay. Do you know if the VMT increases we're hearing that Uber and Lyft are increasing VMT, and someone had a question about how this can be mitigated, especially for trips that are replacing shorter non-motorized and transit trips. I don't know if you've attacked that yet, but I just thought I'd throw that out there.
We haven't locally as part of our project evaluation process, but I do know that there's beginning to be a larger body of literature that's available of projects that are beginning to identify that. I don't have the direct sites memorized at this point. I've been seeing more instances of that. UCLA has done some work. I know New York has done some work. I think that I knew there were some papers that were presented at TRB just last week or 2 weeks ago that I know that's an area of research that I think is getting a lot of play right now. So I'd encourage people to look for that research.
Okay. And you haven't, the other piece of that being, you haven't necessarily seen any evidence yet, or maybe you haven't measured yet, any influence of Amazon shopping versus people going individually to go shopping in their own cars, and whether that has an effect on VMT.
Well, I think it might have an effect on VMT, that as we document it, or as the industry, our profession documents it going forward here. Locally here, we still are seeing we're seeing a variety of modifications in our particular retail and commercial sectors, but it's not attributable to any one single component. We know what we're basically seeing is more individual goods movement delivery, which is why we as a department now are focusing on a curb front management strategy, particularly in those areas where we know that we have those conflicts going on between particularly the Uber and Lyft, the TNC functions, as well as the increased sort of through the front door goods movement types of things that Amazon and even UPS are expanding on. At the same time, we have a fairly robust retail and restaurant sector in Pasadena that continues to draw in quite a bit of car traffic, as well as other travel modes. And so it's one of those things that we are still trying to tease out at the local level. Are we just how much of one is a cause and effect of one of more of those components? The net result here is that we're having to cope with more travel overall because we now have more goods delivery at the local level, as well as continuing to have the similar level of travel to our land uses. We're just seeing a slight differing of mix of land uses, and we're seeing, of course, an increase in the amount of sort of shared office space, shared workspace that goes along with the level of the tech sector that operates in Pasadena.
Okay. And I think one of the points you made just now might relate back to the Uber and Lyft question as well, and that is that curb management has got to be a component of how one deals with traffic mitigation and decide who's going to get access to the curb. That's very important.
Bobby, this is Eric. On the work that we did to develop our report, part of it was in consultation with the City of LA in the development of their program. And on the Uber and Lyft question, there are two of them. One is, and Fred spoke to this, the sort of trip gen side, how much VMT or how many trips are going to be generated now that we're in an Uber and Lyft world. And yeah, I think there's a lot of uncertainty. I don't have anything to really add to what Fred said on that. There's also the mitigation side, because some people will argue that Uber and Lyft, if you encourage shared rides, might be a form of mitigation. Again, there's a lot of question about, are you cannibalizing transit? Are you cannibalizing short walking trips? And some of the same uncertainty applies. The way we are, I think, are coming down on that, or the way LA is that Uber and Lyft could be counted as mitigation if one of the trip ends was at a transit station. So if it's a means to provide first and last mile connections to transit, you could get some kind of credit for that in terms of mitigation, but not generally for a pull-off zone for TNCs.
Okay. A couple of people asked different variations on this, but the base question was, where did the leadership in changing priorities in Pasadena come from? How did the political will come about? how were the car-oriented public emotions managed, lessons learned, and one person specifically asked about that she's working in a conservative, car-oriented area, and wants to know if you have any advice for pitching this type of approach in that type of environment.
Okay. I think the sort of the basic answer to the larger question of how to, what was the political will, or how did that happen, is that the went early 1990s. There was a lot of a huge reaction to the level of development. The city moved off and developed a very strong basis in historic preservation, and at the same time developed a thought about how to manage growth in the city that resulted in what we view now as an infill strategy.
Hey, Fred, we're
channel development into the particular
if,
our central district office. And
yeah,
am I breaking up?
You're breaking up just a little bit.
Pretty substantially. I'm not sure if people are getting any of that. Maybe we're toward the end.
Okay.
Maybe I'll throw in something on that in our report we tried to address the implementation challenges around messaging and different stakeholders. So I would suggest maybe taking a look at that, because if you break it down by stakeholder interest, there's going to be, for example, the development community is going to have particular thoughts about this. City staff is a stakeholder, community at large, and so there's some hopefully helpful anecdotes and suggestions in the report on that. I don't know, Fred, you want to give it another shot and see if maybe the connection is improved?
Sure, if you can hear me all right now.
Mm-hmm.
That's better, yeah.
Okay, I think that I'll do the really short version, and it has to do with it. Pasadena has about a 30-year history of our general plan development that supports an infill strategy, and that infill strategy is essentially based in protecting our single-family neighborhoods by channeling growth into the core where transit and other modes are more prevalent. And what happened and what we were able to do at this last step was take that, was essentially to be able to illustrate to council how, if we aligned our transportation goals and metrics with things that measured that propensity to achieve that outcome,
Well, we've lost Fred again.
It would be, and demonstrated by the use of those metrics, achieve those outcomes. Sorry, must be something going on in my network.
I think it's getting to be a lost cause. We're really losing you here most of the time now.
I think that we're getting all the words. It's just that there's a buffering issue. So there's a long pause sometimes between words. But I think we're almost at the end of the hour anyway. But I would, I'm sure that Fred would be glad to help people work through that if you sent him an email. And also, we do, as Eric suggested, have some strategies in our report. I do want to mention again that a recording of the webinar will be up on the SSTI website tomorrow, and also that the slides will be available if you would like to receive notices of future webinars. You can follow us on Twitter. You can join our newsletter website, which you can do both of those on our front page of our site, which is ssti.us. And I don't know if Eric or Fred want to have any last minute words on any of these.
I just want to thank Fred again for joining us. Sorry for the webinar technical difficulties. One day we will have perfect webinar technology, but we aren't at that day yet. But despite that, the presentation was excellent and really instructive. And I would just, again, mention to folks that if they don't have a demand model, or they don't have the exact, some of the, statutory environment that Pasadena does, that some of these things are generalizable in other ways, and that's what we try to do in our report, and would send you to that. But Pasadena's track record on this is fantastic, and we'll be following them and looking for updates.
Yep.
Well, thank you from our standpoint too.
Well, thank you to both Eric and Fred, and thanks everyone for joining us today. If you have any questions, go ahead and shoot them to us. You can find my email on the reminder that you got, and you'll also be receiving a follow-up email in the next couple of days. So thanks to everyone, and we'll talk to you again soon.